I'd like to introduce Denovan Ellis. And Denovan is our random Rabo guy, as I called him earlier. He's come at the last minute to replace Lachlan Monsborough, who had flight connection issues from Germany. So Denovan is the branch manager at Rabo in Tamworth. And I'd say he's a pretty keen follower of Raboism, because you've been working there since 1989. You must love the place. Before then, he was from a cattle and sheep property in Walla Walla in New South Wales. I'd like you to welcome Denovan. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. Just a slight correction. I was a branch manager. I've just changed roles to a senior manager, which has me more involved, I guess, directly with farmers. So I look after about 35 farmers of all different descriptions in their lending practices and lend to them. So they grain, cotton, beef, lamb, a whole range of producers. So and I probably won't be able to answer every question, but I'll do my best. Just button here. Rightio, so who is Rabobank? So just a little bit of background. So Rabo is actually a cooperative. It's not a listed company. So we had our origins in the Netherlands over 110 years ago. So it's just like a credit union like a little local credit union that might have started in Tamworth or any little village, and they amalgamated together over time to form Rabobank, which is actually considered to be the largest lender to agriculture in the world, in the most countries in the world. So Rabobank's in over 40 countries in the world. And then in the Netherlands, it's a domestic bank, although it has its origins in agriculture. But around the world, Rabobank only lends to primary production or any kind of exporting, importing of food, etc. So it's in the agribusiness space around the world. And therefore, I guess that it has some level of understanding of what goes on, and hence we've been asked to talk today. It's actually in Australia, New Zealand, and everywhere other than the Netherlands, we actually don't lend to any fossil fuel businesses at all. So So in the Netherlands, obviously, they have existing relationships, but so it makes us a little bit unique. So the topic today, talking about global financial regulations and how that might affect the red meat industry. So that's a graph which is a little bit hard to read, but that's changes in CO2 emissions since 2001, and you can see agriculture is the green line down the bottom. So even though in the first 10 years of that period our emissions dropped, they have increased slightly, but we still have, in an overall sense, we've not increased emissions in agriculture compared to many of the other industry areas. In transport in Australia has been the largest growth sector in emissions in Australia. Now that's the different things that people have ambitions, and then there's the realities of different things that have occurred. So the MLA has a 2030 carbon neutral ambition. So, and these are the things that I've observed here. Different corporate companies, large companies, definitely want to become carbon neutral, and in many countries in the world, industry and companies are leading the charge, and sometimes the governments of those countries are falling behind. So the realities of what actually is in place, though, there's some ambitions on the left, but the actual realities of what is in place is, so the European Central Bank, known as ECB, in 2023 wants to have mandatory reporting on the bank's portfolio. So the European Central Bank is like the Australian Reserve Bank, and it wants all of the banks in Europe to report to them on the emissions of their customers. So that means obviously companies have to measure, or borrowers have to measure their emissions, and also that'll be monitored. So Europe is very much leading the charge in some of these things. Emission trading scheme, so in Australia and New Zealand, there's the ability to, in New Zealand, so there's been bilateral agreement in New Zealand that an emission trading scheme is going to occur in 2025. So unlike Australia, where we had one that was only supported by the current government, in New Zealand it's been supported by the opposition as well. So that's an example of something that's definitely going to happen. There's also climate bonds. Basically, in the world, there's around $250 billion that have been raised in bonds, and those bonds are being lent to companies with good sustainability credentials. So basically, there's investors in the world who want to know, and including some super funds, they might mandate 10 or 15 or 20% of their investments must be invested in sustainable products. So there's these bonds in the world that provide that mechanism. So it's only quite small, but that's only been in place for 6 years. Clean Energy Finance Corporation, that was what I was going to say, that in Australia, industry, including farmers, are able to apply for such support from the Australian government, and that's in place. And also in Rabobank, in wholesale lending, since 2012, when they started it, there's 50 facilities now in around the world, in the US, and that's growing. So basically, that's a system whereby if a company can measure its footprint, carbon footprint, and if they can hit certain targets, then the bank will provide to them a discount on their cost of funds. And likewise, if they don't meet those targets, there's a penalty that can apply. So it's a sort of a reward system for companies that are trying to do the right thing. And eventually, obviously, if they can source cheaper funds, it's a very attractive proposition. That's the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. For climate change, which is at the core, there's about 600 scientists involved in that process. So in that, they've obviously looked at land management, and there's a fair bit of information there, but there's nothing on there that Rabobank is concerned about for our clients, for our farmers. And interestingly, a lot of the sustainability factors that are in there are actually mutually beneficial. So obviously, if methane production comes from ruminants, but if you can improve productivity, well, you can effectively produce more kilos of beef for the same amount of methane or less methane. So many of the things there are mutually beneficial, and a lot of it's about productivity and better stewardship of the land, better sustainability of the land use. And in there, they don't want grasslands converted to farming land as a means of reducing carbon emissions. So again, for the red meat industry, which particularly in Australia relies on grasslands as a base, that's a good thing to be, it's working in our favour. Next topic. Right. So basically what do Australian farmers, what might they need to do in the future from a bank's perspective? So essentially, at the moment, there's not many farmers who measure carbon or measure methane or have any kind of, if you're going to play cricket, you've got to score. So we think that people over time will start to score their footprint, their carbon and their methane and whatever other greenhouse gases they might emit. And that will then lead into the ability to become accredited or certified or differentiate themselves from other producers in line with consumer-driven demand or company-driven demand. So often there's companies in the world that want to deliver, like McDonald's, a sustainable product and be able to do that with trust and do that with confidence. So obviously, first thing is to measure. Second thing is to become accredited and certified. And there's an example of that, the WWF and Friesland Campina, which is basically the Fonterra of dairying in Europe, a large dairy company, and Rabobank have a partnership where they were worried about biodiversity in the Netherlands, in particular, on their farms. So obviously, it's a very developed country, and so they've developed this program to identify sustainable farming practices, and that's it's done in conjunction with Rabobank. So Rabobank really has a commitment to sustainable farming, and it really it's a progressing thing. It's not something. I think there's a lot of polarised views in Australia about sustainability and in the world. And often, if you read the actual analytical data and the scientific information, places, a lot of the stuff we need to be concentrating on is in the middle. And so Rabobank has a real vision that it wants to support our clients and our farmers around the world to help feed the world, essentially, because of and there's a lot of talk about meat consumption dropping, but at the same time, other countries, in developing countries, the markets are growing. So it's hard to imagine a world without red meat. There may be calls for people to eat less red meat, but at the same time, there's more people eating red meat in other countries. So we've just got to work out the most sustainable way of doing that. And Lachlan is the guy who actually did the presentation. I was asked for feedback on it a couple of weeks ago, so I had a little bit of insight, but by no means the expert in it. So, but that's about all from Rabobank and me. Thank you.